Row Zero is a spreadsheet for big data that makes it easy to create pivot tables from pivot tables. There are several reasons why you'd want to pivot a pivot. It's typically when you need to do a multi-step or multi-layer analysis. To get started, I've opened a workbook and imported a dataset of US flight data. It's 7.2 million rows of data with one row for each flight in the US for 1 year. So let's create our first pivot table. I'm going to select all, insert pivot table. I'll drop it in a new sheet. And I'm going to first aggregate the transactional flight data to unique routes of carrier, origin, and destination, and also look at the total number of flights for each unique route. So I'll look at count here, and I'm going to sort, and this will give me one row for each unique route. Now I want to see the count of unique routes by carrier, so I can pivot my first pivot table and count unique. So I'll right click on the pivot table, select pivot, and I'll put it in the existing sheet here. I'll just drop it right below. Scroll down, and I'm going to pull carrier to rows, and I will do a count unique on origin. And this is going to give me the count of unique routes by carrier. So let's say I want to only look at recurring daily routes. I can add a filter to this pivot table. So I'll pull count of origin to filter, and I'm going to say where this is greater than 365. You can see my pivot table dynamically updates. So now I can see how many unique daily routes are offered by each carrier. So this is an example where I was able to count unique across more than 2 attributes with cascading pivot tables. Now I'll show one more example of how pivoting a pivot table lets you do calculations of calculations. So I'm back in my original pivot table. I'm going to add a few more fields. So let's add average flight delay, and I'm going to add sum of canceled, and I can format this quick. I'm going to do a calculated column of cancel rate. So I'm going to do sum of cancel divided by count of origin. That's going to give me my cancel rate for each route. I can format. And the nice thing here is now when I go to pivot this pivot table, those calculations are going to be available as fields to use in this pivot table. So you can see here's my average delay, here's my cancel rate that I can use to further analyze my data. So let's take a deeper look at the cancel rate across routes by carrier. So I'll drag carrier to rows, and we'll look at cancel rate a few different ways. So we're going to go from min to 10th percentile, which will get rid of some of the extremes, and we'll look at median and 90th percentile and max. This will give us a sense of what the distribution looks like for cancel rate. I'm going to also pull origin and do a count unique so we see the number of unique routes that this is actually looking at. I can format this, and it looks like I need to add a quick filter to this pivot table to look at routes where there were at least 365 flights, so there was at least 1 flight a day on average. That's going to get rid of some of the noise in here, and you can see this now matches this pivot table over here. So looking at this data, I can see that most carriers had a perfect route that had no cancels throughout the year, and most routes have just a few cancels throughout the year, and even the worst offending routes have about 1 cancel per month. And the last thing I'll show is how all of this data is connected and in sync. So let's filter my origin to, let's say, JFK, and it's going to update this first pivot table and also my downstream pivot tables, and you can see the distributions here change. Same thing would happen if I went back to my source data and updated this. Let's say I rerun and got the latest data, it would update all of my pivot tables and everything downstream. So as you can see, Row Zero makes it very easy to analyze big data sets with dynamic pivot tables. You can try Row Zero for free at rowzero.io and see why Row Zero is the best spreadsheet for big data.